The question is that the bill be read a second time. I call the member for Heffron.
Mr Acting Speaker, the decision to sell the state's or the world's largest coal export port is one of the most significant decisions a government can make. It is a significant public policy decision. It is a decision that should only be made after not only a scoping study, but a very careful analysis of the implication. It should not be made at a whim, at an urgent whim, shoved in a budget under a public relations exercise and be held up as some sort of solution to the renewal of Newcastle. And if you think, Mr Acting Speaker, that this is a well-planned out strategy by the government of the day, I just want to remind the House to a question by the Minister for Ports, who was supposed to have carried on behalf of the people of New South Wales as the manager of the ports, a question asked in the other place by the Honourable Peter Primrose. And he asked the Minister, would he rule out selling the Newcastle Port Corporation in the forthcoming budget? And after the Minister refused to either confirm or deny, as is normal practice for ministers, as to what may or may not be in the budget, the Minister told the other place, quote, If honourable members were to ask me whether I have a plan to do anything like that with the Newcastle Port Corporation, I would have to answer no. So somewhere after the 28th of May 2013, a decision seems to have been made by someone to shove it in this particular budget, because it all sounds terrific. But there is a very substantial problem of public policy, and that is this, that it's not just the hunter, it's not just the state. The country and its economy depends upon this particular port and the exports that are associated with this particular port. The whole supply chain of the export of coal is dependent upon this particular port. Some of those miners could write a cheque out of petty cash and buy that particular port. And then you would have, say, one competitor in control of a major part of the export supply chain. So if you are going to make this decision because you have some philosophical bent to sell, have a look at the consequences of what you're doing. One of the things that you should do, though, and of course, because the consequences could significantly be so great, it is extremely important that it be subject to some sort of scrutiny, that there be some sort of analysis, that you don't pluck figures out of the air. Because if you have a look at the Port Corporation's annual report for 2012, you'll see that their revenue after tax is only about $20 million. And as the Premier told you in question time, the dividends returnable to the state's only about 11. So if you want to work out how, and the Ports Corporation tell you there's only a return on assets of 7.5%. So where these figures of 700 million or $1 billion get plucked out of the air, all relate to promise somehow the renewal of Newcastle, where do they come from? There's been no analysis. There has been no scoping study. And the Premier, I do thank, even though he's rushing this thing through, I thank him for the briefing this morning from Treasury and from his staff, and they conceded that it's only going to be subject to a scoping study. So nobody really knows. They think somehow that the cash splash from Port Botany is going to be the same thing to Newcastle. Now, there are some very substantial reasons as to why, as a matter of public policy, caution should be exercised. One, it's not an ordinary port. It is the largest coal export in the world, which is essential to this country. Two, even maritime industry experts like Peter Van Duyn, published on the 2nd of May in an article of The Conversation, who's a maritime industry expert and has no pecuniary interest, says, and this reminds me from those opposite, but whilst many may welcome the sale of such assets to fund necessary infrastructure projects, others have flagged the concentration of port ownership may lead to steep price rises as well as concerns over regulatory oversight. He points out this, The need to fund infrastructure by the state should not lead to one policy-fits-all approach and includes the sell-off of prized assets such as capital city general port cargo. He points out the international experience of port privatisation is not necessarily reassuring. Privatisation in the United Kingdom took place many years ago, but according to Professor Alfred Baird from the Transport Research Institute at Edinburgh's Napier University, it's not always been a success. He points this out, and this is something that members opposite should really understand and ask their own executive government. The onus on a private port owner is to maximise the profits for shareholders and sweat the assets. In contrast, a public policy-owned port, on the other hand, has the capacity to stimulate regional development by investing in port infrastructure. In relation to the sale of Sydney ports, I want to tell members this. The reason that you got $4.3 billion net for it is that the Sydney Ports Corporation, an organisation that isn't the most competent, I am told that 3/4 of their land they never got any rent for, and the new owners of actually extracting the rent have got back 1/3 of what their outlays were. So the owners actually knew that they could get more out of the place than the Ports Corporation. But in any event, the other matter I want to draw to attention of the House is this. When it comes time to those opposite thinking somehow or other the revitalisation of Newcastle is some sort of planned venture of which they're going to benefit. Remember this, first things first, the State Infrastructure Strategy 2012 and to 2032. Remember this terrific document prepared and reported on by the Honourable Nick Greiner, who in his report to us all said, Infrastructure New South Wales was created in 2011 for the purpose, in the words of the Premier, to set New South Wales back on the path of investment's world's best practice infrastructure planning and deliver to improve the lives of our citizens across this state. The people of New South Wales want our state to be number one again, providing infrastructure that New South Wales needs and deserves in the first step. Do you think there's anything in this 20-year-old plan about Newcastle or a light rail system? Do you think that there has been any examination of its operation with the port? Do you think there's been any costing of any sort of light rail system? Do you think there has been any local environmental plan or planning study for the revitalisation of Newcastle? Who has been consulted? Has the council prepared an LEP? Where's the transport strategy? Here's this document 2 years in the making because the government didn't have the ability to plan the state, and it's not in here. So who's responsible for running this joint? Who's responsible for the planning? Who's responsible for the infrastructure development? And where is it? It's not here. And the reason it's not here is it's just something that has been pulled out of the air in the last couple of weeks without a scoping study to try and get the reporters of the metropolitan newspapers to say what a wonderful government and a wonderful budget it is. But the trouble is that the reporters will write the next story today and tomorrow, and in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, not only this state, but Australia has to put up with the stranglehold of private ownership of the entire eastern seaboard method of import and export from this particular country. And if you want to know something else in relation to what happens when you alienate these ports, when you have a look at this particular document, and if you have a look at this particular document, which Nick Greiner chaired, when they made reference to what the plan was for this state before you sold off Port Botany and Port Kembla, it said this: once Port Botany reaches capacity, which is not expected to happen during the time frame of this strategy, it is planned for Port Kembla to become New South Wales' supplementary container port. Well, I can tell you what, the members of Illawarra can forget about that ever happening, because this owner is going to sweat the assets, because we have given up control, this Parliament has, of one of the most essential vehicles on the eastern seaboard, and now we're going to give up control of the largest coal export port in the world without scrutiny, without scoping studies, without having any idea of how much revenue we're going to get. And if we're only getting $20 million a year profit out of the Newcastle Ports Corporation, where you're going to get 700 or $1 billion out of it, I have no idea.
Very good.